You're listening to Mammal Watching with Charles Foley and John Hall. You can find other episodes at mammalwatching.com/podcast.
Welcome to the Mammal Watching podcast with me, John Hall in New York.
And me, Charles Foley in Minneapolis.
Hi, Charles. How's it going?
Very well, John. I don't know if you saw the article last week in the Guardian newspaper about a recent wildlife census that was carried out in South Sudan, but they found that the wildlife migration in the Sud of South Sudan is far bigger than originally thought. So, by way of context, the largest big mammal migration, so not including bats, it was always thought to be the movement of wildlife in the Serengeti ecosystem, which is mainly wildebeest and thought to be somewhere in the region of 1.8 to 2 million animals. Well, in the mid-1980s, a large movement of animals, mainly white-eared kob, was discovered in the swamplands of South Sudan. And a WCS survey in 2007 estimated this to be about 1.3 million animals, which made it the second largest migration on the planet. So a couple of years ago, the management of two of the national parks in South Sudan, namely Boma and Badingilo, were handed over to Africa Parks, and they've been conducting a wildlife survey across the area. And this survey has been led by Mike Fay, who some people may know as the person who did the mega transect across Central Africa in 1999, and who helped set up the network of 13 national parks in Gabon. Now, astonishingly, they recorded an almost unbelievable 6 million animals, making this by far the largest big mammal migration on the planet. So 5 million of those were white-eared kob, with about 350,000 Thompson gazelles, 300,000 tiang, which are like a topi, and about 160,000 bowhor reedbuck. And this is a year-round migration of animals from the southwest to the northeast of the country, passing into Gambela, into Ethiopia. And of course, South Sudan has been in the middle of a civil war for the past few years, and it's still really unsafe to visit. But the government would eventually like to open this area up to tourism. And I must admit, I'm very glad to hear that Africa Parks is operating in the country, as they are probably one of the most effective conservation organizations in the world. And if anyone can manage these areas, it's them. So hopefully, in a few years' time, people can start visiting this area, which of course also has the Nile lechwe, which is a very cool ungulate. But for now, it's just heartening to know that such a large movement of wildlife still exists.
Wow, isn't that amazing? I saw the headlines on Facebook, and I was thinking if they if they've ever overlooked 5 million animals for the last few years, then we have these episodes talking about trying to find the last few Vaquita today and the last few Saola. But there's like 5 million antelope running around. No one's noticed until very recently. It's extraordinary. There's hope for everything.
I know, it really is.
Yeah, what an amazing story.
And how about you, John? Have you come down from your high of seeing what is now almost certainly the world's rarest mammal?
Just about, Charles. Yeah, so I'm very pleased that we'll be talking to two of the people I met on my Vaquita trip in just a few minutes. But yeah, what a wonderful opportunity that was. But as I said in my trip report that you might have seen, I don't think I've ever felt so many emotions in the space of 3 minutes. Certainly not from looking at a mammal, from all the stress leading up to this of whether I would be able to get a spot on this trip. And it was all very touch and go to the last minute. And really, thanks to Todd, our friend Todd Pusser, for really getting me on that boat, and to all the people who then agreed. And then when I was out there, would I see one? And then seeing one. And then it was, wow, I'm seeing the Vaquita I never thought I would. Isn't this fantastic? To then hearing the voices of the others on the boat who've been looking for weeks and probably only seen the same two animals for 3 weeks, and they were beginning to think there were just two left. So their reaction, of course, was joy that, well, there's another 4 here we haven't seen. That's great. And then thinking, seconds later, but hang on, there might only be 6 left. And, if they keep decreasing like we think they are, then this might be the last time anyone ever sees them. So it was a whirlwind, a roller coaster of emotions. But yeah, I'm so privileged to have been out there, and thank you again to all those people on that wonderful research group for letting me come out there. And I'm very glad we can tell the story of the Vaquita now to reach a bit of a wider audience.
Yes, I imagine it must have been an absolutely astonishing moment seeing those animals. And As I always keep on saying, John, you were born under a lucky star.
Under a lucky hat. So it was extraordinary. It was bittersweet for sure. But it was such a great opportunity, as well as the animals, to meet this incredible research group out there and to watch them in operation. They really are just a superb group of professionals, and they give them a whole new whole new understanding for me to sort of whale watching. The way they go about it is absolutely fantastic. So let's meet two of them. So Charles and I are really pleased today to be joined by two of the people I met when I was down looking at Vaquita in Mexico a month or so ago. The two of the people who know most about the Vaquita species and also about its recovery, and together they're leading the conservation work to try and save this mammal. We're joined by Dr. Barbara Taylor, and she's been researching marine mammals for over 40 years. She led the Marine Mammal Genetics Group at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center in California for 15 years. She's retired from federal service, but she's still an active independent scientist who specializes in assessing the risk of extinction. So together with Lorenzo, who also joins us, Lorenzo Rojas-Bracho, she was chief scientist on all the Vaquita surveys. Barbara has chaired the Conservation Committee of the Society for Marine Mammalogy, and she serves as the listing authority for the Cetacean Specialist Group at the IUCN. And Barb is joined by Dr. Lorenzo Rojas-Bracho, who's calling in from Mexico City. And Lorenzo worked for 25 years as a head of marine mammal research and programs in the Mexican government's environment sector. And he's still working on cetaceans and vaquitas now, although he's retired from government. Most of his professional work is focused on vaquita conservation research through the formation of multidisciplinary working groups. And together with Barb, he's co-directed and participated in all the Vaquita population assessment surveys since the end of the 90s. He is a member of the IUCN Cetacean Specialist Group, the Red List Authority, and works on marine mammal protected areas. Also chairman of the International Whaling Commission's Conservation Committee. You won't be surprised to hear they've both won many awards. Barb's include the Society for Conservation Biology's Leroux Award for her outstanding career achievements in translating conservation science into real-world conservation efforts. She's also won the American Cetacean Society's Lifetime Achievement Award. Lorenzo also won the Edward Leroux Memorial Award for his work with Vaquita. He's also won the Society for Marine Mammalogy's Conservation Merit Prize, and he won a BBC Inspirations Award. Barb, Lorenzo, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Yes, absolutely wonderful to have both of you over here. Very distinguished CVs indeed. So let's perhaps just start off by getting from both of you how you got interested in cetaceans and how you actually ended up working on the Vaquita.
Well, I'll take the lead here. I actually started as an undergraduate working on a National Science Foundation study on harbor seals, and that gave my foot in the door to do cetacean work. And then I went to Alaska and spent a lot of time with bowhead whales and with harbor porpoises. And then when I came back to get my PhD in San Diego, I actually wrote a chapter on how difficult it would be. In fact, in the paper, I actually pointed out that vaquitas could go extinct before we had enough precision to say that they were declining because of the standards that scientists use. Shortly thereafter, Lorenzo walked into my office, and sort of the rest is history.
And you, Lorenzo?
When I was about 7 years old, I went to SeaWorld, and I was really fascinated with the killer whale. And so I went straight to the office there and asked for a job. And of course, I didn't get it. But I was recommended years later to a friend who were opening a dolphinarium in Mexico City. And I started working as a trainer for dolphins and sea lions. But the captivity issue was not what I really liked. And I decided it was better to go and study biology. Originally, I was doing humpbacks, but then I published a term paper on vaquitas, and we decided it was better to change my PhD thesis to Vaquita. I went to Barb's office, and as she said, the rest is history.
So perhaps both of you could describe your roles in the Vaquita project. But Barbara, would you mind, first of all, for our listeners who haven't come across the Vaquita, do you mind just briefly describing what the vaquita looks like and what it is.
Vaquitas are one of 7 species of porpoises. Porpoises are different than dolphins in that they don't have a beak, so they look like teeny tiny killer whales, and they are typically found in very productive northern waters, and they have a very high rate of echolocation that allows them to operate and find small fishes in these really productive waters. And vaquitas are special for a number of reasons. One is I think they're the most beautiful of the porpoises. So they're a very small marine mammal. They're about a little bit over 5 feet long and a little bit over 100 pounds when they're full adults, which for a cetacean is very small. And they have a beautiful makeup job. They have sort of black lipstick and a black ring around their eyes. And for a porpoise, quite big flippers and big dorsal fin, which has been thought to be something to cope with the heat in their environment. So they actually are a desert porpoise, unlike the other typical porpoises. Its nearest relatives live in South America, but they have been isolated from those porpoises in South America for about 3 million years. And they have this very special place far, far in the northern Gulf of California, where there's very high tides that stir up very good nutrients from the bottom that have settled there from the Colorado River over many millions of years. And that tidal fluctuation makes it, even though it's nice and sunny, where typically you don't see very productive oceans because of this muddy, turbid area, it's a perfect porpoise habitat. So they're isolated way up. That's their Latin name is Phocina sinus, because they're Phocina means porpoise and sinus means they're all the way up in this very special habitat. So they have a very small distribution, the smallest distribution of any porpoise naturally, and they've always been naturally rare. So it makes them especially vulnerable to fishing efforts because they live in a small area that is highly productive, and it's highly productive also for fishermen. And I guess just a few other things about their biology. Porpoises typically mature around age 4 to 6. They can have calves every year, and they probably only live to be in their low 20s. So that means that their growth rate is also very low, which also makes them vulnerable if they are accidentally caught in fishing nets.
And could you tell us a little bit about what your role in the Vaquita project has been thus far?
So I've had sort of a dual role. When Lorenzo came to my office, it was discussing genetics, because vaquitas basically have very low genetic diversity. And they had low genetic diversity even when Lorenzo was looking at samples from the 1980s. And the question was, how did that come about? And through the years, the genetics has gotten better and better. And now we can look at the full genome of vaquitas and tell that they have been naturally rare, probably in the low thousands of individuals for at least the last 200,000 years. And oddly, that actually makes them less vulnerable to inbreeding depression, which is something that conservation biologists worry about when populations get to very low numbers, that genes that are not particularly good genes will be exposed because near relatives are forced to mate together. And vaquitas seem not to be very vulnerable to that. So that's been one of my roles, is on the genetic side. And then the other side has been collaborating with my Mexican colleagues, both to do visual and acoustic surveys, and being on the recovery team. And I don't want to steal all of Lorenzo's thunder, but I guess I've been more concentrated in the visual side, because the laboratory where I worked developed a lot of the methods used to be able to estimate abundance of whales, dolphins, and porpoises. And so a lot of the surveys of that laboratory were actually done collaboratively with Mexico over the whole tuna dolphin issue. And so we had the skill set to be able to bring the right tools on the visual side to be able to estimate numbers of vaquitas.
And Lorenzo, what has your principal role been in this?
Well, that one was already mentioned by Barb, working together on genetic, I would say genetic assessment. And when I started working with Vaquita, the position of the Mexican government, or many officers, and it extended for several years, was that the population was too small to do anything to protect it. And so that's how we started getting into the genetics and trying to show, and we published a paper in 1999 probably, showing that Vaquita was not open to extinction because of genetic makeup, and that's more or less what Barb described. But then I also started talking to the Mexican government, and at the end I finished working with them to have a national marine mammal program and make the center of that program Vaquita. And so I proposed them to create the International Committee for the Recovery of Vaquita, which was accepted. And we have in that committee, we haven't met for some time for political reasons, but Barb was one of the first members on that committee, and we designed together how the committee should work. And then we had many other of the best, I think, people in the world participating in our committee from Europe, Canada, the US, and Mexico. So it was been pushing the recommendations we made from the recovery team. Basically, the idea is that if you don't eliminate gill nets and reduce bycatch to zero, Vaquita will not recover. And so we have made a series of recommendations to that effect, which they have not been properly implemented, and we can talk about that later, but at least it has given time, or bought time, to the Vaquita to not go extinct. And then I left the Mexican government, and I always participated in the, let's say, the organizing committee of the surveys, which I did also when I was in charge of the marine mammal program. And this year was a bit different. I coordinated what we called Operación Esperanza, Hope, Operation Hope in English, which is a project that was funded by the United States Trade Representative, and it's carried out by the National Marine Mammal Foundation. I'm working for them right now. And that's in coordination with the National Commission of Protected Areas in Mexico, and also in coordination with the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, and mainly to support the government of Mexico efforts for the conservation of Vaquita. And the idea is to support these efforts by using state-of-the-art technology and involving the fishing communities. And so in these surveys, what we did was sample environmental DNA to determine in the future areas where we cannot go with boats or survey because they're complicated, and see if we can find Vaquita DNA and determine if the Vaquitas are using those areas. And then we also have a photogrammetry program with drones, which is a technique to obtain and interpret reliable information of images from objects in the water. And this is, in the case of Vaquita. And then we can determine health, size, and even estimate through size the potential age of the animals. We also train and work jointly with communities. So we train young professionals from the communities to fly drones and and donating a drone so they can continue doing Vaquita work and other work too as well, not only with Vaquita. And we also train people how to sample DNA, and also working with the communities to see if we can come to the difficult part, which is transitioning to alternative fishing gear from gill nets. That's the risk factor that is driving vaquitas to extinction.
Back when he was leading the Mexican Marine Mammal Program, they developed, I think, one of the world-class acoustic programs, which is absolutely vital data for vaquitas.
Yeah, I hadn't realized until sort of meeting you guys fully how much acoustics are used for cetaceans, and talking to Bob Pittman as well. I was accustomed to using detection for things like bats, but for cetaceans, it seems equally useful and important. Lorenzo, you've touched on this a little bit, but you used the word complicated at one point when you're talking about your efforts to conserve the vaquita, and it is an extraordinarily complicated story, I know. Can you talk a little bit about what happened since the late 90s, when I think the first Vaquita survey estimated around 600 animals to today, where it may even be single figures?
The answer to where we are, it's relatively simple, but it's, as I said, proving very difficult to solve. So no administration or no government through the years has been able or has been willing to eliminate the risk factors that is driving vaquita to extinction. And so, as I said, incidental mortality in gill nets. And the solution is to eliminate gill nets, replace them with alternative fishing gear. And the reason this has been done also is because there is a irresponsibility of the fisheries authorities in Mexico. And it's called the National Commission for Fisheries and Aquaculture. That's a federal agency that their mandate is to develop alternative fishing gear. But this authority at best has been absent, using the words of the United Nations. But I would say they actually have blocked the development of any implementation of fishing gear other than gill nets. Doesn't matter how much enforcement you have. It doesn't matter how good science you have, as long as you don't have alternative fishing gear for fishermen and fisherwomen to bring food to the table and sustain their families. If there's no alternative fishing gear, it will be very hard to protect vaquita and recover the population.
Can I just ask, why is it being blocked? Do you have any theories as to why the authorities are absent or blocking the new gear?
Well, it's difficult to respond because we don't understand it. I mean, the alternative fishing gear is off the shelf. The things are there. It's just need to bring them to the upper Gulf and really test them properly and have a strategy to test them. Why hasn't that happened? I'm not so sure, but I can tell you a story that once I was flying back home from a meeting in Sonora, and my neighbor in the row was the head of the fisheries department at that time, and I asked him directly, why don't you support vaquita? I mean, not only that, at that time, in that year, they had transferred gillnet permits from the southern part of the Gulf of California to the upper part of the Gulf of California where vaquitas are. And he told me something like, if we pay too much attention to vaquita, start doing conservation actions and banning gillnets and all those things, then we will not be able to fish anywhere, because then there will be sea turtles, and then you will have dolphins in another place, or seabirds. And that response was so eye-opening. It was like, we have the most primitive fisheries authorities in the world, probably. They care more about fishing and producing than conserving the ecosystem. If you destroy that ecosystem, you will not be able to fish in the future. So that's the only thing. I guess they keep doing that. And otherwise, it's hard to have another explanation to that.
Wow.
If I can, add some aspects. The gill nets are globally the biggest threat to porpoises and dolphins and seals for that matter. And so it's a global issue. It's an extremely efficient way to kill things. And if your economic situation is such that you need to put food on the table, you're going to go with the most efficient way of doing that. And it's gill nets. So there's a real short-term but understandable view. If you live and you're poor and you want to make a living and put food on the table, you're going to use a gear that doesn't require you to use a lot of gasoline to make it work. So gill nets, you just put them in the water, you let them, what they call soak for hours. They kill everything. Then you pull them out of the water and then you go home in your boat, but you don't actually have to actively pull it anywhere. So it's a little bit more complicated to convince fishers not to do something that is easy for them to do and cheap for them to do. And that's why it requires some active participation of the government. And through the years, Lorenzo and colleagues have been very good about, getting economists in. There have been various programs that have been tried, but as long as you have corruption in the system so that the cheaters are always going to win, and you're trying to use a gear that's probably less efficient than the gear that they're using, that's a really difficult transition. You really need both sort of a carrot and a stick. And in this case, you don't have the carrot or the stick. And so it's been very difficult to make it work. And one of the reasons that I'm especially passionate about this is because you could have blue markets, both in Mexico City and in San Diego and Los Angeles. You could consume all of the seafood that is caught in that productive environment and pay blue market prices for it, but only if you can get past the people who are vested in the status quo. And of course, having Totoaba come into the picture, where now you have an internationally illegal poaching market for a large fish that, its swim bladder, which is what's valued in the international market, is per kilo worth more than gold or cocaine. It's even harder to work against that super lucrative illegal market. And so you have all these levels of illegality and a lot of people who are profiting from it. And so it's really, I think, a global issue of how do you get out of this bind with corruption and be able to put things on the right path. And I don't know what the answer is, but so far we haven't found it for Vaquita.
How important is the Totoaba fishing in all this? Is that what's really driving the fishermen to go into the key Vaquita zone, or are they just generally fishing?
So since we started working with Vaquita 30-something years ago, there has always been Totoaba fishing. Even though it was banned in 1975, and for some strange reasons, gill nets were only banned until 1983, I think. There has always been Totoaba fishing. Now, it's not clear exactly why suddenly in the mid-2000s there was an explosion of demand of the swim bladder in China and Hong Kong. And I was in Hong Kong, and one thing I was explained is that some of the Chinese alternative products or medicine for traditional Chinese medicine, like sparrow nets and other things, were discovered in Hong Kong, basically, that they were contaminated or polluted with DDT, and that it generated health issues. China, continental China and Hong Kong knew that there was the Totoaba around there. They'd have it exporting that, and it had been used by Chinese communities in California and in northern Mexico. So they went back, and that seemed that demand or these issues increased the demand of swim bladder in China. But the issue has been translated more into a financial international crime, and we can discuss that later. But that's how we have Totoaba fishing in the Upper Gulf now. Fishers jumped to Totoaba because they could make tons of money. And when we started working, we started hearing from fishers that called me home and told me that something was going wrong. You have these young fishers buying new trucks and spending tons of money, and it has to do with Totoaba. We didn't understand at the time what was happening, but then we discovered it was this fishing Totoaba for the swim bladder. And so one fisherman reported what he made $116,000 in one fishing day. So as you can imagine, when corruption and illegal activities pay more than conservation, then it's very easy to move to that. Now, not all the fishermen, of course, went illegally fishing for Totoaba, but many did, but also attracted fishermen from other areas, from southern Mexico, and most importantly, attracted organized crime. That the whole thing just exploded, and Vaquita population was declining, and Barb can correct me, about 8% per year before 2013, when the whole thing exploded, and then we lost about 50% of the population every year because the gillnets used in Totoaba, the mesh size is about the size of the head of a vaquita. So they are easily entangled, but it's important to make clear that that's not the only gillnet killing vaquitas. We also had shrimp gillnets, which have a very small mesh size, 2.5 inches, and they also kill vaquita because they use gillnets that are over 1 kilometer large, and so that creates a barrier. Anything that goes there gets entangled, and vaquitas too.
The thing that has made Totoaba nets particularly deadly is that because it was an illegal activity, the way that the nets were used was changed to because poachers were trying to avoid being caught. And so the nets were set with huge anchors on the bottom and left to soak there basically throughout the entire spawning season of Totoaba. So they come up to the Gulf in December, and then spawning season is basically over by May. And so in a traditional fishery, the fishermen would be putting their nets out for, a number of hours to soak, maybe up to 8 hours, and then they would take them away. But these were anchored 24 hours a day on the bottom throughout that entire season. And, that was particularly deadly for vaquitas. But if you look at the numbers in my career of vaquitas that have been killed, 1997 to 2008, we went from about 600 to about 200. So 400 vaquitas died. And even though there was Totoaba fishing, most of that was for shrimp and other fin fish. And the shrimp was being sold in the United States. So it is all gill nets, but it is a more complicated problem when it comes to what do you do to stop it and to change the practices of the local fisheries that have these very different markets, the extremely illegal market. And I might say that Totoaba was the first marine fish that was listed under the Convention for the International Trade of Endangered Species. So it's completely illegal. And in part, that makes it even more lucrative when it's being sold on the black market.
Some of those gill nets, we had a program to remove all the ghost nets, or those nets that are not any longer under control of fishers because a lot of those gillnets were lost as fishermen left them, as Barb explained, for hours and then or days probably. And even to camouflage, there was a net there. They would tie seabirds to the net. And so the authorities couldn't see the buoys holding the nets. But a couple of times, Sea Shepherd and Museo de la Ballena at that time were working on removing those nets. One of those nets, I think, had about 60 or 80 sea lions entangled, dead in those nets. So you can imagine, and sharks. And then we had large whales entangled. So it was not only Vaquita, it's just hitting very strong the whole ecosystem in the upper Gulf of California. But the alternative gear that it's off the shelf now has been used by a small group of fishers, and they have been able to fish about the same than a gill net. But you need to be a very, very skilled and experienced fisherman to use that type of alternative gear. Small group of fishers were able to sell that 3 times more expensive than they had fished with alternative gear. So in all this complexity, there is an option, but you need a fishery authority to implement and really be willing to help with that. And because it's not happening, but nobody uses the alternative gear for many of the reasons Bob already explained. But what happens here is that fishermen use gill nets, and authorities have a blind eye to that. So if you can use alternative fish, if you don't have to move to alternative fishing gear and you can continue using gill nets because of corruption and because the authority doesn't care, then there is no incentive to move and test alternative fishing gear. And same way, there is no incentive to stop fishing for Totoaba because you make money and everybody makes money with that. So it's a several layer problem, and it's hard to solve.
Can I just ask that you talking about the alternative methods and they catch fish with those, it's more valuable. Why is that the case? Is that because it's environmentally friendly and people pay a premium, or is it somehow the fish in better condition when it's caught?
Yeah, no, we don't have a blue markets. No, here it's because when you fish with gill nets, the fish is not preserved as well as when you fish it with a one. So when you use a gill net, you have to disentangle the animal or the fish from the net, and then in this way, the quality goes up. In this past survey, we went to have ceviche with the fishers that fish that way, and the quality of the fish is impressive. I mean, that's why they got a better price, and so the option is there. It's not an easy one, and it implies more effort by fishers, but it's there.
Where do the Chinese authorities stand on this? Because it's illegal to catch Totoaba, and it's presumably illegal to import it into China. And yet I see documentaries about the Vaquita, and people are walking into these stores and openly, being sold swim bladders. So it's not really very hidden there, it seems. What do they say when this comes up in meetings?
I remember there were some political complications there, that there were Chinese companies trying to invest in Mexico and develop a gorgeous area. They wanted to develop these hotels for I think directed to Chinese consumption and in the Gulf of California, and they were also building a special train to connect Mexico City with other countries, with other states in Mexico, within Mexico. And the environmental impact assessment made by authorities forbid the Chinese government to build those resorts and that train, and that created a lot of tension between Mexico and China. So when a Mexican delegation went to China and talked to the Chinese government about the Totoaba issue, the response of the authorities in China was, this is your problem, it's not a Chinese problem. So if you have illegal fishers, that's something you have to deal with. If they are Chinese citizens, well, catch them or arrest them. But it was not an easy relation with China. I attended a couple of the meetings with the Chinese government. They denied it. and say they were doing the best they could to protect, to prevent the trafficking of Totoaba to China. This is a global organized crime. It has to be, as a Mexican friend wrote, that there is a very tight control of capital inflows and outflows in China and Hong Kong. So Totoaba has turned to be kind of a commodity used for international crime. And so one intermediary abroad collects and another in China pays. And in this way, there's never a bank transfer that leaves paper trail for authorities to track. And then so that money is used to contraband or traffic, anything, arms, drugs. So it has turned to be a very complicated issue. This complicates the relation with China. And just recently, we've heard that swim bladders from Totoaba are not only used in China and Hong Kong, but it has extended to Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And it's basically the same rules that traffic drugs will traffic wildlife, which is the second. I'm sure John knows about that. Is the I think after arms and drugs is one of the largest financial crimes internationally.
Yeah, what a mess and how difficult. It's just absolutely tragic.
And yeah, there's, as you say, incredibly complicated, so many different elements. And part of it all just stems from the tragedy of the commons. If some people are cheating, then it just ruins everything for everyone else who might want to do it legally. But let me just take you back to this latest survey, because you'd been talking about the numbers going down, first of all, by about 8% a year, and then year on year, you were seeing 50% declines. What did you find in this latest survey that you just did? What was it, last month or the month before?
Yeah, so we did a survey in May, and it's basically similar to the surveys that we've done since 2018. So let me back up just a little bit and talk about what happened during the collapse of, Mexico's largest endemic mammal, which had a small distribution to begin with. And then as this collapse happened, the distribution right sort of at the very end between 2015 and 2018 decreased quite drastically into an area that was quite close to one of the fishing towns, San Felipe. And the recovery team, seeing that collapse in area and knowing that enforcement had not been at all effective in trying to save vaquitas, said, you should put your eggs in this basket, basically. There's this small area where the vaquitas, we have evidence from the acoustics that the vaquitas are mainly staying in this area. Focus all of your efforts there, and gave the name the zero tolerance area to this small area where vaquitas remained.
How big an area is that, or how small an area is that?
So it's quite small. It's about 10 kilometers by 12 kilometers, about 125 square kilometers. So, and it's quite close to San Felipe, so a very easy boat ride out there. And the idea was that it was going to be an easy place for enforcement because it was close to the Navy facility, the town, and it's small. Yet when we went out in 2018 to do a survey, 2019, again in 2021, we were trying to use photographic identification to estimate the number of vaquitas that were in that area, and also to see whether they appeared to be healthy or not, and whether they were having calves. So all sort of things that you need to sort of maintain the interest in conserving vaquitas. And what we found roughly around 10 vaquitas in each one of those years, plus or minus some, but also unbelievable numbers of gillnets in the water. So in 2018, the Mexican government switched over, so a new administration, and that administration terminated subsidies that had been being paid to fishermen not to fish shrimp and other finfish. And so there was a period when there was actually relatively little gill netting for the legal species, not Totoaba, but shrimp and finfish. And then starting in 2018, all of a sudden the fishermen were not receiving payment to not fish. And so, of course, they went back to fishing. And they went back to fishing in the area that was closest and had the highest, profit for them, which was like right in the zero tolerance area during shrimp season. So we were out there in the fall. And so we were seeing enough net in 2021, 117 of these small type fishing boats, pangas, each with at least 1,000 meters of gill net out, meaning that area, the quote unquote protected area, had enough gill net in it to run the length of it 5 times over. So it was both good news in that we were seeing calves, we were seeing about the same numbers. So it appeared that the decline had at least slowed down, because the expectation at that point would be that vaquitas should have been extinct. So we had these individuals that were managing to survive despite this, really insane level of gill nets right where the vaquitas were. So then in 2022, the Mexican Navy put out these concrete blocks that are about 1 meter by 1 meter square, and they have like 3 meter tall hooks on them that are metal hooks that are put there to entangle gill nets and deter, therefore, the gill net fishermen from wanting to use that area, because they don't want to lose their nets. That's a huge financial loss to them. And it actually seemed to work. So throughout this period, the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society had been working on vaquita conservation in the early years, removing these illegal and untended Totoaba nets. And then in the later years, in the last few years, they have been basically safeguarding, counting every single hour how many pangas are in the zero tolerance area. And then if they see illegal fishing in that area, they report it to the Navy, and the Navy comes out. Meanwhile, the fall period was getting windier and windier, and you have to have very calm seas to be able to see vaquitas. And so we moved our survey period to May in both last year and this year. And that's a lower fishing time, but also there's been, depending on how you estimate it, an 80 to 90% reduction in the number of gill nets in the area where those concrete blocks have been put. So last year, we estimated again that there were around 10 vaquitas. And this year, with a very similar amount of effort, our best estimate was between 6 and 8 vaquitas. And that was worrisome. And so as a result, the Sea Shepherd and Mexican government are collaborating to put acoustic recorders back out in the areas where we used to see vaquitas, which are not very far away, to see whether that could be a real change in the number of vaquitas or whether vaquitas have shifted their distribution, and we're basically need to extend the area that we both sample acoustically and visually to be able to understand what's happening to the status of vaquitas.
Oof, 6 to 8. Okay, that's that is a very low number. And so I seem to remember that the AZA, the American Zoological Association, they got involved in this as well and were hoping to capture some individuals. Can you explain a little bit of what sort of conservation efforts are still going on in the area?
I mean, we were depressed when we knew that or estimated the vaquita was declining about 8% per year. You can imagine how depressing it was when we found out that the population had really dropped from 600 to 200. We decided that the situation was very critical and we discussed, and it was, I think, one of the most difficult discussions we had in the recovery team, that we didn't know if Vaquita was going to survive for a year or more, if there was another Totoaba season, and almost anywhere you went, you could see those pangas with gillnets. So we discussed what the options were, and we thought we can catch Vaquita and bring them to a safe haven. We knew that we were getting in difficult waters when we proposed to do that. And it was a huge operation. So we established an independent review panel and an expert advisory group. So we sent them the protocols and they reviewed them. And then we had to look for sites where we could put the sea pens to keep the vaquitas. But then we had to accelerate our times to implement these programs because the 2018 Totoaba was coming and it seemed that it was going to be a pretty intense Totoaba season. Once you found vaquitas, we would try to rescue the vaquitas. We had teams from Denmark that they had experience catching harbor porpoise in Greenland and European waters, so they came to help. And once you had the vaquita, we will bring you to an initial housing and care facilities very close to San Felipe. And if everything worked, then we would be reintroducing animals in what we thought was going to be a gillnet-free area. And I mean, we developed this land-based housing to have vaquitas, and we designed these floating sea pens. I mean, there were Nobel Prizes for these kind of things. We had all the Nobel Prizes that you can have in this kind of operations. Just trying to remember, I think we had like 90 participants all in all from 9 different countries, and we worked for a month or two, and we were able to deploy that 3 times and caught 2 animals. But sadly, one of the first animal we caught was a very young animal, and it was too stressed, so we had to release them. And the second animal, sorry, as all females, was not lactating, and it hadn't been pregnant for some time. But that died during the operations in a very sad and difficult way. So that didn't work. And I mean, there are several lessons from that. Our next option was to propose these, have a larger sanctuary with a zero tolerance area that Barb described, at least to try to protect those animals in this area. So that was that attempt. And after that attempt, we have been insisting in this alternative gear development. And I think the failure there has been not only the fisheries authorities have failed not helping, but also when they did something, they didn't really incorporate the fishermen to help with that. But I would say there has been progress with the zero tolerance area, at least quite some time, despite we saw less animals, and that's important, I think, to underline what Barb describes is not a population size estimate, it's just the number of different vaquitas or distinctive vaquitas that were sighting during the survey. And I've seen through the years, in the last 2 years, probably more coordination, at least between the Mexican Navy and the Secretary of Environment. But all this better coordination, it's really limited to the zero tolerance area, because outside the zero tolerance area, there is, and John, when you were there, you were able to see, I think, gillnets almost everywhere. So I think that has been the best improvement, and probably the best thing that it has happened since I think we started working in Vaquita conservation over 30 years ago, to have this de facto sanctuary for vaquitas. And still you see gillnets for Totoaba, and you see gillnets for Sierra and other fish. So the next steps have to be that. The good news that it would not solve, but at least it's a step in the correct direction, is that the Secretary of Environment, through the National Commission of Protected Areas, taking at least what I mentioned before, taking over the mandate of the Fisheries Department, who has been failing, to at least bring the fishermen to workshops and involve fishermen more directly using alternative fishing gear. In 1975, the Scientific Committee of the International Whaling Commission said that there was a risk for vaquita, because vaquita lived in an area where gillnetting was intense. And in the early 1990s, a group of scientists have really counted and even estimated the bycatch, the mortality in gillnets. So we knew by the 1990s that there was a problem, but I think at the end, if I always think about, like, why solve a simple problem when a complex one will do. And what I mean here is, at that time that we knew that gillnets were dangerous for vaquita and we could lose the population to bycatch, in the early to mid 90s, there were about 300 pangas in the upper Gulf, or 400 pangas. Now we have over 1,000 legal pangas, and probably around 2,000 if you consider the illegal pangas and what fishermen think how many illegal pangas there are. So that was the time really to work to move to alternative gear. But we didn't. We we allowed the problem to get more complicated, and then what it seemed like a simple problem, in reality, the task now involves controlling more pangas, more fishermen, a more major social and cultural changes, and more political will. And now the medicine is more bitter than it could have been at that time. But even going through all that, I think I'm still optimistic things can be done. And I think there has been some very strong international pressure, and that has been recognized at least by one officer at a very high level in the Mexican government. It's international pressure that it's pushing the government to take action. And I can see the Commission for Protected Areas, I mean, they really want to do something. And I think they need that help of international pressure to improve any conservation actions. So yeah, there's improvement, but not enough improvement.
It's good to hear this. You still have some optimism, despite how much more complicated things have gotten since people recognized this was an issue, and what a familiar story that is, not to deal with anything till it's almost too late. But for both of you, I mean, there's a new government in Mexico, a new president. What do you think needs to be done in the near term and the longer term to save the species?
So I think we're all holding our breath over this summer's research. And one of the reasons that I haven't lost optimism is that I mentioned that we were using photographic identification to help us understand how many we're seeing in this small area. So the zero tolerance area is 12% of the distribution that Vaquitas occupied less than 10 years ago in 2015. And their best habitat is not in the zero tolerance area. It's on some sort of ridges that are nearby in the Northern Gulf. And the individuals that we saw in 2018 and 2019, quite a few of them had notches in their dorsal fins. And those notches are almost certainly a result of animals that were entangled in gill nets and got out. And we are, still wondering, why have the vaquitas decline sort of either slowed or stopped when they should have gone extinct? And part of the reason could be that the animals that are left are not a random subset of animals, but are animals that are especially careful around gill nets. And these animals, we were seeing them in amongst all of those gill nets in 2018 and 2019. So there's nothing to stop them from swimming over to the next ridge, which would mean that we wouldn't see them in the zero tolerance area. And in fact, we haven't seen any of those notched individuals in the last couple of surveys. But we did see one individual that has sort of an individual sort of a wiggly dorsal fin. That was one that we saw in 2018 and 2019, and we didn't see it again until this last year. So that gives me hope that the vaquitas are still out there nearby, and that the acoustic research that's planned this summer will give us some guidance on whether they're out there, and that we can go and look for them. And then we'll need to, work closely and intensely to try to give some protection to those real survivors that are the hope for the species. And then I guess the other thing that I would leave people with is that, as I mentioned, this is a global issue. It's not only vaquitas, they're the closest to extinction, but we have many other species of dolphins and porpoises that are found only in coastal waters or in rivers. All of the river dolphins are on the IUCN Red List as threatened with extinction. And the biggest threat by far is entanglement in gill nets. And I think it's really important for people to understand that eating seafood isn't always the friendly environmental thing to do, that the biggest threat to marine mammals globally is fishing. And the consumer can have a role to play in not consuming fish that are caught in ways that are driving species extinct. And I think it's just something that tends to not get so much publicity, that, consumers can play a role, not in every situation, but certainly in some situations, to try to make fisheries truly sustainable, not just for the target species, but for the bycatch. And bycatch is a real problem for all of the long-lived marine species, all the mammals, but also the long-lived fish and sea turtles. And, if we want to have biodiversity in our rivers and coastal waters, we need to change our practices.
Yeah, well, you'll be happy to know that neither John or I eat fish, ghastly stuff. Can you ever see the international community and Mexican government going back to trying to capture those last few individuals, or is that now totally off the table?
That's, I think, completely off the table. But the learning curve is really steep when it comes to bringing animals to semi-captivity or captivity for conservation reasons. So with the very few animals we have, you cannot risk another animal I don't see that coming. I would be too risky. I don't see any scientists willing to get involved in that. I don't think the observers that are the key part for the fieldwork willing to go to a survey to catch vaquitas again, and I would not do it. I mean, it was so painful and it's so risky. We should have started these when we had 400 animals.
One of the real lessons learned from vaquitas is that as conservation biologists during the sixth extinction, we need more tools. And, we realized that we knew too little too late to be able to deal with something that's very common in mammals, capture myopathy. And, the veterinarians need to have some time to learn how to care for individuals. And so we're now very actively taking that lesson to heart and involving veterinarians in these other conservation cases that I mentioned. And, we need more tools in the toolbox, and we need to really bring together a lot broader set of skills to be able to solve these conservation problems, not only veterinarians, but, if we could go back 30, 40 years ago with sort of the conservation strategies that are used today, bringing in sociologists and economists and early on engaging the communities and how can we both give you a healthy lifestyle and preserve biodiversity.
A final question over here. Is there something that people like our listeners and the broader conservation community can do to help, or do you feel that it's already too late?
There's a new administration coming, and I think that this new administration has to start immediately with conservation actions, because in our history of vaquita conservation, every administration that comes in wants to reinvent the wheel, and that's changing the name of the conservation strategy. And if I count how many administrations have come into power and then they lose 2.5 years deciding what they're going to do with vaquita. So at the end, we've lost 12 years probably of no action. We need a new administration to implement a short, medium, and long-term strategy, because every administration that comes in misses a real strategy that goes from one administration to the next, and this one has to work on that. And we have to involve experts, and I will take that from Barb, in putting the local fishing communities at the center of the conservation efforts. I mean, there is International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, has an expert group focused on influencing human behavior and behavioral change. And there is this behavioral change task force. You have to bring those, and there are people in Mexico that can also do that. So certainly and urgently, we need to change and restructure the fisheries authorities, this administration, because I mean 30% of the fisheries production in Mexico comes from illegal fisheries. So you have to change that structure as well.
So if I can pitch in on what can the average person do about a situation like Vaquita? It seems so far away and so complicated. And I think there are a couple of things that people really can do. One is, take your role as a consumer very seriously, and really think about the consequences of having seafood that comes from another country, and you don't know what the fisheries management is like, and that that takes some time, but I think that that's something that can be done on your very local level. I think another thing that I would be remiss in not saying is that I think there might not be vaquitas there today if it hadn't been for private NGOs stepping in and removing a lot of nets and being there as guardians. And, there's really two that have been fundamental, the Museo de Ballena in Mexico, which isn't participating in vaquita work any longer, and the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, which is still there and very actively participating in really critical levels. And so, supporting those organizations, I have to say, if you're a young person and you're thinking about getting into conservation, boy, you get a firsthand look by going on some, these Sea Shepherd campaigns. The work that they were doing early in the Totoaba period was just really on the ground, tough, hard work. And so I think that is something that, anybody could get involved with, either as a donor or as a participant. And then, the other thing in terms of encouraging people in education is that there is, I think, a bigger and bigger and more critical role for people who have the skill sets to come in and do conservation, not as conservation scientists, not that that's a bad thing, but it's sort of been made very clear to me personally that we conservation scientists contribute a very important part, but there are so many other parts that are critical to solving the problem. And having people who can come in and work with the communities, figure out how to solve the behavioral problems of humans, which a lot of conservation scientists are not very good at. I mean, that's something where we really need skilled and dedicated people to be coming up through the ranks to really help with this biodiversity crisis.
I'll say one thing there, because when we started with Vaquita conservation, we looked for conservation economists or conservation sociologists, and we couldn't find many. We had a few, and now that it's clear now that that's needed. You need these transdisciplinary teams, and I mean transdisciplinary because you need to work with the wisdom of scientists, of social conservation scientists, and the communities to succeed. And we didn't have that when we started with Vaquita. We had very few. To succeed, you need public opinion to be on your side and support it, and that's something you have to work. I think every conservation program needs a communication team that it's able to bring out the word of conservation. And I would make a call to NGOs, because NGOs, many started working with Vaquita or got interested in Vaquita once it was very critical. And once you had a identified villain that were like the China. But these NGOs also need to get involved with those population or species, and I think Barb mentioned before, that are already not as critical on Vaquita, but if we don't do something for them, they will be the next Vaquitas. And NGOs have to jump there timely and not wait until they are in a critical state.
First of all, that's Barb for talking about Sea Shepherd. I think I also was really struck by the role they're playing, the wonderful work they're doing on that boat, the Seahorse and the crew. And I was thinking that would be a wonderful thing for my kids to volunteer. I actually told my daughter she should think about volunteering for them. The people there were so great. So we'll put a link up in our notes about how people can donate or even volunteer for Sea Shepherd. And I'll also do a bit of digging to find out if there are ways people can find out where they're getting their seafood from and whether it really is sustainable in terms of bycatch. More generally, thank you both for such a fascinating and such a sad story about, we just stop using gill nets and everything will be fine. But in reality, it's so complicated. It's all about people, the fishermen, the consumers, the government, the public policy people. What a mess, but also how wonderful people like you, Lorenzo, and you, Barb, are working on this. And trying to save this species while there is still time. You've given us some optimism. Thank you for that message of hope.
Well, thank you very much for having us. I hope that people learned a lot about vaquitas and just generally marine conservation.
Yeah. Thanks, John and Charles. We really appreciate you doing this because this is the way really to bring the story out and have people support conservation.
Yeah, and let me just add my thanks over here. Absolutely fascinating. Very difficult to hear some of it, but I certainly learned a huge amount. And thank you for everything that you've been doing to help conserve this species.
Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Mammal Watching with Charles Foley and John Hall. You can find other episodes at mammalwatching.com/podcast.